Hi, my name is Tom Gaze. I'm director of the Rockefeller Institute of Government, and I'm happy to welcome such a nice crowd today for a very important topic, healthcare politics, looking backwards and forwards. Just a few months after the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act was enacted in early 2010, Richard Kirsch asked me whether the Rockefeller Institute might have room for him and a research assistant to work on his book about the passage of this historic legislation. I was happy to give Richard some space to work on the book. I used to do work on interest groups in the United States many years ago, and Richard's organization, which I had been following a bit over the previous couple of years, had been absolutely fascinating to me. Richard was national campaign manager of, I think, one of the most interesting advocacy groups in recent years, Healthcare for America Now, a coalition of over 1,000 national, state, and local pro-reform advocacy organizations in support of national health care reform. Well, at the beginning, I really had no intention of publishing the book ourselves as the Rockefeller Institute Press, but I liked it so much, I went ahead. I did ask him to cut it down, and he did by about 100 pages. It's still well over 300, but it's still well worth reading. It does give a sense of the politics of reform that no other book I've seen has been able to give so far. And it's good in many respects and well worth noting. It's great about the personalities and their relationships involved in this complex negotiating process. I don't see Jim Messina here at all. It's wonderful about developing the ideas and the origins of the legislation. And I think it's especially interesting about the insight it gives you about how advocacy is really conducted now. I mean, many years ago, I used to talk about the distinction between inside and outside strategies, and some groups did one, other groups did another, and there's a pretty good divide among American interest groups in how they do it. Well, he throws that distinction out the window. They do both all the time and highly integrated. He also talked about the difficulty in mobilizing support even within the Democratic Party, which was no easy matter at all. And I think he really provides an untold story about the grassroots activities on the side of healthcare reform supporters, not just the Tea Party opponents. Most of all, however, he really shows how hard it is to enact major domestic initiatives in the U.S. political system, even when the national government is nominally controlled by one party and there's fairly broad public support for the basic goals of the legislation. I think that's an important point. It sounds maybe trite, but it should even comfort Justice Scalia, who I know is very concerned these days about waking up some morning and realizing he's going to have to eat broccoli. So this book has been well received and widely reviewed, and I urge everybody to buy a copy, maybe for graduation presents, etc. And so they're around. Now, today we'd like to use Richard's book as a basis for a discussion of the politics of healthcare reform, politics in the broad sense of bringing about change in what our governments do, including the changing politics as healthcare policy making has been moving into the court system and out to the states and into a very uncertain political future. We'll start with Richard, who will reflect on his book and experiences. He was, as I mentioned, Healthcare for America Now. She's not only the national campaign manager, but also spokesperson, and he was quoted in many national newspapers, on many TV shows, including the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, ABC World News Tonight, etc., even Fox News Network. Most important, he was, of course, on the Colbert Report, where he refused to make a clear choice between saving national health care reform or rescuing a little old lady. Since health care reform did survive, I guess there's no more little old lady. Now, before his work with Healthcare for America Now, he was executive director of Citizen Action New York, a grassroots citizens organization, and executive director of the Public Policy and Education Fund of New York, a research and educational foundation. Then we'll turn to Hank Greenberg for a discussion of one of the more surprising turns in this story, the role of the courts in reviewing this legislation, as well as anything else Hank wants to comment on. Hank practices law with Greenberg Traurig here in Albany in civil litigation, criminal and civil investigations, health law matters, as well as regulatory and administrative law. Over the years, however, he's had many public positions. He served as counsel to former New York State Attorney General Andrew Cuomo. Importantly, especially for today, he served as general counsel for the New York State Department of Health, and he's served before that as counsel to the Lieutenant Governor of New York State, Assistant U.S. Attorney, and where he prosecuted many federal criminal cases, including white-collar crime and public corruption. And he was law clerk for, at one time, Judge, later Chief Judge, Judith Kaye of the New York Court of Appeals. And then we'll turn to Jim Knickman. Jim is probably better qualified than just about anybody to put healthcare reform in a New York context. He's president and chief executive officer of the New York State Health Foundation, a private foundation dedicated to improving the health of all New Yorkers. Under Jim's leadership, the New York State Health Foundation has invested $70 million since 2006 in initiatives to improve healthcare and public health system in New York State. And the foundation has been especially active in efforts to reduce the number of uninsured, to deal with diabetes prevention and management, and integrating substance abuse and mental health services. The foundation is also especially notable in measuring and tracking the impact of its activities, which makes a lot of sense in light of Jim's previous work as Vice President of Research and Evaluation at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where he led and oversaw research initiatives, external evaluations of RWJF's national initiatives, and internal analyses relating to grant-making priorities. Before that, he's been a scholar for many years at the faculty of New York University's Wagner School. He's also taught at Princeton, Rochester, and other fine universities. So we will start with a short presentation by Richard and turn to Hank, Jim. After that, I'll ask a few questions and we'll open up the conversation to everybody else. In the meantime, please turn off anything likely to make noise, cell phones, beepers, etc. And when we do have an opportunity for you to ask questions, please use the mic and identify yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. I actually think Carl spent $100 million or more convincing the seniors that it was actually healthcare did kill them. So, good morning, everybody. I know this is an august body and academic institution, but I also know you can do better than that. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you, and throughout the crowd, there are scattered faces of folks that I've worked with through the years, and so welcome to everyone here, and thanks for that wonderful introduction, Tom, and for publishing the book. It really was a huge gift and a surprise to me, and working with you as sort of the super editor and your whole staff has been fantastic. And I'll sign copies for everybody you like when we're done here. So the subject of this is the politics of healthcare, looking back and looking forward. And so that's what I'll do in the little bit of time we have here. I'll look back at what were the basic politics that drove a lot of the campaign, although it's hard to do so in 15 minutes, and that's what the book's for, right? But then I'll also look forward a little bit, too, to the extent that we can have any kind of crystal ball in what is obviously, between the court and the election, a very, very cloudy situation to project. But I think if you're talking about politics and healthcare, you need to start with like what healthcare means in people's lives. I mean, the reason this issue has kept coming up, Drew Altman from the Kaiser Family Foundation says every 19 years on average, that the country continues to try to find a way to get to a government guarantee of affordable health care is because health care is so deeply personal. You meet someone, you say, how are you? How's your health? What's the expression? You know, what you don't have if you don't have your health. It's so important to you. And in a country where, despite the fact that we spend so much more in health care than any other country in the world, that we leave now 50 million people without coverage, that 6 out of 10 bankruptcies, healthcare is a contributing factor, and that even those people with health coverage have this tremendous uncertainty. If you lose your job, will you have health coverage? If you want to start a small business, you can't do that because you don't have health coverage. If you are forced to retire early, you want to retire early, you can't do that. And all these tremendous fears that if you're sick could be crushing financial pressure. Oftentimes, if you have insurance, most of those bankruptcies are for people with insurance. And if you don't have insurance, and then, we look at the fact that the data shows that for every million people in this country who don't have insurance, 1,000 die prematurely each year. And I talk about some of those people, the families of some of those people, in fighting for our health. So the politics are fundamentally driven by the fact that this is an important issue, vital, that our political system has failed to address, unlike that of most of the rest of the world. And then you look at some of the economic data that keeps this as a key economic issue from year in and year out, the drop in employer-sponsored insurance over the years, the fact that even for those companies that continue to offer it, it's such a huge issue. We see it in collective bargaining, but we also see it in those countries, most companies which aren't unionized, still tremendous pressure to cut benefits, raise the amount that their employees are asked to pay, while the businesses are struggling to make their health care costs and trying to figure out is any way to save money, and the tremendous costs of those business. And even for the people who have national health care, because remember, everybody over 65 in this country and people with severe disabilities have national health insurance in this country. But as we've shifted more and more costs to those folks and higher deductibles, and as the costs go up and the 20% co-insurance, people having to buy medical coverage through the supplemental coverage, it's still a pressure throughout the whole system. And so for Democrats, at least, this is an issue that couldn't be avoided, because for their key constituencies, this is an issue that they kept talking to their elected officials and demanding over and over again. And they couldn't avoid it. Now, this is where organizing for change helped crystallize that lack of avoidance. So I talk about in the book that early in the primary process, in the Democratic primary process, before their Democratic primaries, the year leading up to that, Center for American Progress and SEIU held a forum for all the Democratic presidential candidates in Las Vegas to get, just on healthcare, to get their position on it. The reason that Healthcare for America Now started in 2008, and we started planning for this in 2007, was that our whole goal was to be sure that if a Democrat were elected president, he or she were elected with a mandate to work for coverage and a particular vision for coverage. And so we started in 2007 forming this coalition, and we did so not of healthcare groups. We did so of the largest organizations capable of moving people principally, and also ideas who shared a broader sense of progressive values. And so as major labor organizations, major community organizing networks, Move On, the largest Netroots organization, as well as key constituency groups like NAACP and National Council of La Raza and the National Women's Law Center as a steering committee, and the principles were policy principles that were many years in the making. And they weren't broad principles that anyone could agree to, like everyone should be covered with quality care. They were specific enough so you could actually draft legislation from that. And the formation of those principles, I'll talk a minute about sort of where some of that came from, but the key thing about that is that they were, by having a common vision, a common purpose, were able to do something which no one thought possible, which was to keep the coalition together despite all the enormous pressures that happened in a campaign of this sort and all the ways that the legislation kept getting whittled away in the legislative process. And the book, for those of you who are interested in sort of how do you form broad coalitions and campaigns to make change, in the book there are specific lessons we did which were different than any other coalition and campaign of this sort that really provided the strength and the glue and the ability to move people. And so one of the things we did is we then took those principles, we turned them into a congressional choice of which side are you on? And we said to candidates and members of Congress, will you choose two visions? One, quality, affordable health care for all, which was our principles, and two is on your own with the insurance industry, which was the menu of basically conservative nostrums for change. And from a factual point of view, one was the Obama plan. It also would have been the Clinton or Edwards plan, because there was a consensus among the Democratic candidates and the Democratic base. And the second was the McCain plan, because there was a consensus among the conservative base. So we didn't say the Obama plan versus the McCain plan. In effect, what people were signing on was one of the two, and that was a choice that candidates were asked to make. And by Election Day, we had 140 members of Congress signed on to our side, including a senator from Illinois who stood in Grant Park and accepted the nomination in November of 2008. And so the point is that we took this broad political consensus, we built a political movement, and we did it to create a mandate for a specific vision of change before the election. And it's interesting because all the other healthcare reform groups sat on their hands throughout 2008 because they didn't know what was going to happen, who would win, what was going on. And we had to create this tremendous momentum going into this. Now, there was a lot of intellectual work that went into this. One of the things I talk about in the book is a several-year process of public opinion research at a deeper value-based level than that was normally done with a whole different instrument to really understand where the public was and understand the barriers, to deal with what pollster Celinda Lake, who's one of the people we work with, said is this fact that for decades people have told pollsters that, and 2/3 of people said, we want a government guarantee of health care for all, we'll pay more taxes for it, and still when the political debate comes it all falls apart. And through that we learned key lessons, including one that you saw first Senator Clinton say, and then when Neera Tanden went over to Senator Obama's campaign after Hillary lost, him start saying, first thing is, if you like what you have, you can keep it. Because the key thing is people are so scared of change on something as personally close as healthcare. And so there's a dilemma here where the solution is the problem. People have a tremendous sense of the problem, but when you get to the solution, they start worrying because, again, it's so personal. So you need to reassure people, if you like what you have, you can keep it, or before you can get people to think about change. The other thing we learned is you had to tap into anger because we knew what our opponents would use as fear. And, of course, we saw that in the death panels and so much else when the legislative campaign fought. But no one ever said, I'm scared as hell, I can't take it anymore. To get to him, I was mad as hell, I can't take it anymore. We needed to have fear and anger, anger at the current system, anger at insurance companies denying your coverage, anger at the fact that you're turned down for care, that you're not getting payment for things your doctor says you need, and from that, hope of a solution. Because in so much of political change, anger is the trampoline and hope is the sky above, and you need to have that dynamic. We also spent time developing new policy approaches. And something which I came up with, and so did Jacob Hacker, a professor at Yale, came up independently, was the idea of cutting through this age-old sort of two choices that progressives had. One with national health insurance, single payer as it's oftentimes known, although it's a pretty clunky name. The other is having everyone required to buy private health insurance. And we both independently came up with the idea, why not give people a choice of both? And the important thing about the public option, which got tremendous ability to unite progressives around a common program, had tremendous energy and was popular throughout, despite the huge attacks by the right-wing ideological machine and insurance companies on it, was the choice. People weren't so sure about the public part, because isn't public insurance inferior? That's what people have learned and thought. But they still wanted it, because that's better than nothing. And they wanted a choice, as we said, a choice of regulated private health insurance that's going to have to give you the benefits you need, or a public option so you're not at the mercy of the private health insurance. Or as the president said when he was saying this, and he went back and forth between defending the public option and apologizing for it, it will control costs and keep the insurance companies honest. So one other thing about being prepared with lessons, one thing that was very important in leading into this fight is how much there were veterans of the Clinton fight. I came up with the public option idea in an article I wrote in 2003 where I was finally far enough away from it to get over my depression and write about it and think about the lessons there. But throughout Congress, the chairs of the key congressional committees, Pete Stark and Henry Waxman particularly, and so many of their staff had lived through that. Key people the administration brought in, key academics and policy advisors. We had all lived through the 93, 94. We had big scars on our back, but we had those lessons fresh enough to bring them. And so we knew, for instance, that we did have to find a way of accommodating the major industry forces. That another repeat of the Harry and Louise campaign was a problem. And so the administration basically made a deal with the prescription drug industry, where they made some concessions, but rather than having the big battle about whether we're going to limit their price, what they could charge for Medicare prescription drugs, that battle will wait another day, and it will come because of the cost pressure. But that meant instead of $200 million being spent against the bill, a little more than $100 million was spent in mild ads to support the bill, a huge difference. Even the insurance industry, because of a structure where they get more customers and with a mandate, for a long time were willing to go along with it. And they tried to fight tougher regulations. They tried to have a stripped-down version of it. And starting in September, when thanks to Chuck Schumer and Olympia Snow, the penalty in the mandate wasn't so great, some of the insurance industry sort of surreptitiously went against it by funneling $86 million to the Chamber of Commerce. But they were along far enough to get certain momentum. And then the hospitals and doctors who understood that we get a lot of new patients, particularly the hospitals. Doctors don't seem to need new patients. But also for hospitals and for doctors, understood that this system was not sustainable. That you really can't in the long run exist in a system with such tremendous cost pressures, with so many people being left out, with hospitals being asked to serve people who don't have insurance, with doctors, frankly, being sick of insurance companies trying to run their practices. And so that was important. But beyond those politics, there was something else throughout. And this is something we can't miss, which is for Democrats, still, why did they go through this? How could they put up with this tremendous pressure? And that was a combination of history and the personal stories that I started with. The history being that they really felt an historical imperative. There's a reason that Harry Truman, when he introduced his bill, did on the exact day 45 years before that Harry Truman had put in his bill. Harry Reid, what did I say Harry Reid the first time? Harry Reid the bill, and he basically, because he was following Harry Truman. And there's a reason that Barack Obama kept talking about Harry Truman. There was a sense of history here. Excuse me, Barack Obama kept talking about Teddy Roosevelt. They were all totally into history, trust me. They felt that. And they also felt the personal stories. And what we did in our campaign was take those personal stories to Congress. So there's a very moving story in the book about the little boy, the little African-American boy you see standing next to the president when he signed the bill. How did he get there? He got there because of this huge grassroots campaign that Washington Community Action Network ran to get Patty Murray, and it's a fascinating story, to get Patty Murray to become not just a supporter but a champion of the bill. She's fourth ranking in the Senate. And those are the kind of things that we did. We took people's personal stories. There's a woman who's a minister in Nebraska who had cancer, who told Ben Nelson her story and almost had him in tears. And Ben Nelson was a key swing vote. And so much of the book is these personal stories of how we got individuals over and over again to talk to members of Congress. And we can be cynical about the politics, but when they were listening and saw the members of Congress and had a sense of being part of history, that actually made tremendous movement. And at the end, that's what carried the bill through this legislative shoals. The fact that the sense of history, the sense of personal commitment was such that Democrats were willing to do something which they thought was a huge political risk. So I have like 2 minutes to look forward, and I hopefully will spend a lot of time in the questions, and I know that both Hank and Jim are going to do that. But I want to come back in the 2 minutes to the big question of politics in this. The reason the legislation is still, it's not really unpopular, it's misunderstood. If you look at the best polling, it's by Kaiser, and they asked 4 questions. They don't give the choice, do you like it, you don't like it. They said, do you think it should be stronger? Do you want to keep it as it is? Do you want to repeal it and replace it? The biggest group, about a third, who want it to be stronger. Now, why is that? Because you know what? Really, for almost everyone in the country, the law never passed. Yes, there are 2.5 million people, including one of my daughters, who are under 26, kids who are getting health insurance now. Yes, seniors are paying less for prescription drugs, and people around the country are paying less for preventive care. But the thing I started with, the reason people really want this, so they don't have to worry about losing your job means losing your health coverage, going bankrupt because of health coverage, that won't kick into 2014. And so people are right. We want it to be stronger because they don't understand all these nuances. They just know it's not there. When you add them and the people for it, they're 50% for it and 40% against it. And a lot of them are confused too. And it's very partisan. And so the real task is how do we get to 2014? And we'll talk about the challenge in the courts. The biggest challenge immediately is the election, because the election really will be a referendum on health care, because the court will likely to at least keep most of the legislation intact, even if not the mandate. But whether that'll really last will depend on who's elected president. And the big debate underneath that will still be, will basic health security be provided? And that's the question we have to drive through 2012, through 2013, if we're going to see that promise made in 2014 to actually finally provide a guarantee of quality, affordable health care to everyone in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for those wonderful remarks, and good morning to everybody. I feel as though it's somewhat unfair that Richard got to talk about the exciting and extraordinary work that culminated in this wonderful legislative victory, and now I, as the only lawyer on the panel, have to talk about the not so exciting, frankly, scary prospect of what we may see in late June of this year when the Supreme Court finally hands down its decision. I'm also struck, too, just as a preliminary thought, Richard talked about how the key players in this battle were channeling history. One piece of history that's largely forgotten, and which makes it so fitting and appropriate that we're all here today talking about this, is that the fight for universal health insurance in this nation started in this town, in Albany, in 1918 and 1919, when New York, it's long forgotten, but New York was the first state in the nation to pass a compulsory health insurance law in one house. In 1919, 9 very brave progressive Republicans joined arms with the United Democratic Party in the state Senate to pass America's first compulsory health law. The bill unfortunately died. A very, very conservative and justly long-forgotten Speaker of the Assembly decried the bill as, in his words, a Bolsheviki plot. Well, here we are today, nearly 100 years later, and we're listening to critics talk about European socialism. It's unfortunate, but what we see, and I think the fundamental point, and it really underscores the tremendous work that Richard did, is that healthcare reform is not for the short-winded. It is for those who have the stamina and willingness to fight. And not just fight in one branch of government, or two, as we're seeing and as I'll talk a little bit about. We need to think three-dimensionally. because the battle is never entirely won, and even when there is a victory, that victory has to be fought over and over again by each passing generation. And with that thought in mind, let's talk a little bit about where the nation's eyes are currently riveted, which is that large ivory building in Washington, the United States Supreme Court. And what we're witnessing in the court is an extraordinary moment in constitutional history, really a once in a generation, really only a few times in a century do we see the court fundamentally deciding a seismic political issue. Now, while that is a rare event, it's not a unique or an unusual event. I think de Tocqueville got it just about exactly right a couple hundred years ago, early in the history of the Republic, when he observed that one of the signal features of American democracy is that inevitably all political controversies get resolved as judicial controversies. For better or worse, that's the way it is. I think looking back at over 200 years of American history, for the better. But the Supreme Court does get the final word, the last word. It is, I think, as Robert Jackson rightly put it, they're not final because they're infallible. They're infallible because they have the last word. And so it has occurred with the Affordable Care Act in the Supreme Court. And let me say, I think it's clear that the justices of the court are acutely aware of what's at stake here for all concerned. They have to be mindful of the palpable human dimension of the case. 30 million uninsured Americans, their future health insurance hangs in the balance. The President of the United States, the signature legislative accomplishment of his first term, hangs in the balance. The United States Supreme Court itself, its credibility, its stature as a neutral, fair, non-partisan arbiter of American constitutional values, that hangs in the balance. And so the justices are clearly aware of that. That's why they devoted 3 days of oral argument over 6 hours. They haven't done anything like that for over 40 years. Not since the Voting Rights Act was challenged in 1966 has the court devoted this much time to an issue. They've received more friend of the court briefs from interested parties. It's a polite form of judicial lobbying, more amicus briefs than they have ever received in any case in their history. And so they are really tackling, well, it's 4 issues, but what we're really talking about is 3 issues, each of which are of enormous importance. The first of which, of course, is the constitutionality of the individual mandate. The challenges of the law are arguing that Congress lacked the authority under the Commerce Clause to require all people who can afford health insurance in America to pay for it on pain of having to pay a penalty. Now, that issue turns really on 7 words. 7 words in the United States Constitution. In Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, the powers of Congress are enumerated. And it says that Congress has the power, quote, to regulate commerce among the several states. To regulate commerce among the several states. Now, if we could go into a time machine, and let's flash back 5 years, 8 years, and we collected 100 of America's leading constitutional scholars, and we put them in a room, and we gave them a hypothetical, as law professors do with law students, and we said, here's a bill. By the way, it'll look exactly like the Affordable Care Act. And here's the individual mandate in the bill. And we blinded these experts to, you don't know who's in favor of it, and you don't know who's opposed to it. You don't know, for example, that the mandate is really the brainchild of the Conservative Heritage Foundation, as opposed to being supported by a Democratic Congress. You don't know that. All you know is what the precedents are from the United States Supreme Court going back over 75 years. You know that health care represents 17% of the GDP of this nation. You know that 83%, every year, 83% of Americans, one way or the other, participate in the health care market. You know that 95% of all Americans, once every 5 years, participate in the health care market. And you ask those 100 experts, well, does the individual mandate regulate commerce? I dare say that most, many, virtually all would say, of course it does, and would not think the argument to the contrary to be terribly serious. Well, it now is being taken terribly seriously, it appears, by at least 4 justices and maybe more. And of course, justices of the Supreme Court, unlike that scenario I described for you, they don't live in an intellectual vacuum. They don't decide cases in the abstract. Like all of us, they are marinated in the reality of our times. And so we see that it's very possible that the individual mandate may be struck down. It might not. I cling to the hope and belief, I confess, somewhat shaken after hearing the oral argument, that there are 6 justices that are prepared on very narrow grounds to uphold the mandate. But nevertheless, if you listen to the talking heads and the more experienced commentators who watch the Supreme Court, they will tell you that the mandate is in trouble. And if that's the case, then the court will turn to the seismically important issue of how much of the law will stand if the mandate is struck down. What will become of those parts of the law that are already in effect, and I think, as Richard alluded to, are enormously popular? Will, going forward, parents rest assured that their children will be able to stay on their policy until age 26? Will insurers now again be able to impose lifetime limits, lifetime dollar limits on essential benefits? That's the issue that the court would then take up. And the potential answers, I think, can fairly be grouped into 3 categories. On one extreme, there would be the view that, at least it appears Justice Scalia seems to be fond of, that if the mandate is struck down, then the entire bill has to go. In other words, that the mandate is the heart of the bill, and that the bill can't function without it. Or, as Justice Scalia suggested, it wouldn't be appropriate for the court to go through the 2,700-page Affordable Care Act and pick and choose those provisions which ought to stand and which provisions ought to fall. So that's one option on one extreme. At the other pole, at the other extreme, is the view taken by the 11th Circuit, whose decision is now before the court, which is that the mandate falls, but it can be severed from the rest of the law, so that the balance of the Affordable Care Act would remain in place. The middle ground presently is being staked out by the Obama administration. They are arguing that there are provisions in the bill that are so inextricably linked with the individual mandate that they must fall, but that the rest of the bill should stand. And so, for example, some very important market reforms in the bill, the ban on insurers denying coverage based on pre-existing conditions, guaranteed issue requirements. The Obama administration is arguing that the mandate is necessary in order to be able to fund those requirements, because without the mandate, the net effect would be a significant increase in premiums nationally. So that's the middle ground, that some portion of the law stays in place, notwithstanding that the mandate itself has been struck down. And that takes me to the last issue, which has not received a lot of attention, but I must tell you, in some ways it is the most important issue if the court gets to it. And for those of us who believe that the federal government has a powerful and important role solving national problems, a very frightening issue, which is the challenge to the expansion of the Medicaid program under the Act. Now, under the bill, it requires that all persons who earn less than 133% of the federal poverty level be eligible under Medicaid. 26 states are contending that that expansion amounts to a form of coercion. In other words, even though the federal government, at least for the first few years, will pay for the expansion, states don't have the option of turning it aside. They either accept the expansion, or otherwise the only option that they face is that they withdraw altogether from the Medicaid program. These 26 states are saying that that's unduly coercive, that it implicates core aspects of sovereignty, that the net effect of that kind of take-it-or-leave-it proposition encroaches on fundamental rights of states. Well, If the court ultimately accepts that argument, I think it would at least cast a cloud upon potentially hundreds and hundreds of federal programs in which the federal government doles out dollars to the state based on certain conditions. Things like funding for highways, mass transit, public colleges and universities. If the court accepts the argument that the Congress has gone too far in imposing conditions, if nothing else, I think it would dramatically unsettle the potential viability of those kinds of programs. I think most people think the court will likely either not get to that issue or alternatively not accept the view of the states, but I think we need to watch that very carefully. Let me offer, just as a closing thought, before I pass the baton here, to one prediction that I think I make with some degree of confidence if the court ends up striking down the individual mandate. I said it's not unusual for the United States Supreme Court to decide transcendently important political issues. That's true. What does strike me as very unusual, maybe unprecedented in the court's history, is that it is posed to hand down a decision in this unbelievably volatile political issue in the heat of a presidential campaign in late June. So one thing we know pretty much for sure, whatever the court does, it will play out in the cauldron of a presidential campaign. And what the implications and impact are is anyone's guess. But if the court does strike down the mandate, and if the president is reelected, we will see an interbranch conflict like nothing the country has observed, I think, since at least the Great Depression, when Franklin Roosevelt early in his administration faced a 5-justice majority that with great frequency was striking down key features of the New Deal. That led, of course, to Roosevelt's proposed court packing plan, and for a year the nation was riveted on that conflict. Ultimately, while the president's court packing plan was thankfully defeated, he prevailed because the swing vote, the Anthony Kennedy of his day, Owen Roberts, ended up voting with greater frequency with the so-called liberal majority at the time. But I don't think that kind of conflict bodes well for the nation. I don't think if it occurs, it's something that's good for the court or good for anyone. So I hope, for hope's sake, I think we all should hope that that doesn't come to pass. But this much I am certain. I think we all need to stay tuned. We all have to fasten our seatbelts, because if nothing else, we are in for the political, judicial, constitutional rides of our lifetime. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate the opportunity here. I want to do 3 things, talk a little bit about the book, and in a sense use it as an excuse to ask Richard 2 questions that he can address later on. I'm going to take your role away. And then I also have a question for Henry, also that related to the Supreme Court. So, but let me start off with about the book, and then I'm going to turn to how does this affect New York, what's happening in New York, and where does this tie in, which is something I'm always focused on and interested in. First, this is a really great book. You should read it if you haven't read it. It lays out just how you go about bringing the community and people who have intense interest, intense stake into the process of public policy making, which is a very strange process. And it's interesting. I've taught public administration, public policy, public affairs for a long time, although that was a while ago. And we talk about the public policy process, but in settings like that, I don't think we bring this type of information to our students about how the importance of getting public input and sort of coalescing groups who are interested in an issue involved. And this is about how social change is going to happen, I think, over the next 5, 10, 20 years. So understanding the processes, and it's so well told in story form in this book, so I really recommend it. I, of course, also liked in the book the discussion of the role of philanthropy, and how this thing got financed. And I think that's, from my point of view, that's a fascinating story, because we all, always wonder how our crazy institutions of philanthropy make decisions. And I think there's a nice discussion of that, of how Atlantic really came through and some other funders came through to make that happen. And just the role of complexity, of how something as complex as this bill has to be translated to the public and bring them along. And frankly, I think that's been one of the problems right now, is things are so complex. I can't believe how many people I come in contact with, from pretty elite leaders down to real people, who say, I just don't understand the issues. They're too complicated for me. And I think that one of the things Richard and his colleagues were able to do is, at key times, make this tangible to people and get them coalesce. So that was important. So, the interesting thing about the book, though, from my read, is most of it took place before, before the Tea Party election and the real polarization. I mean, and I think, as you said, when we were talking about McCain versus Obama or Clinton, there were differences, but they were differences that I could sort of translate. I could sort of say, okay, here's how McCain differs. And in some ways, McCain mostly differed by this magical thing where they said, we're going to have everybody buy insurance on the public market with tax credits, and all we have to do is take care of the chronically ill, and we'll do something special for them because they would muck up the insurance markets. And I remember always writing emails to Doug Holtz-Eaton and saying, do you realize that those chronically ill are 80% of the healthcare costs? I mean, it's not just a little thing, it's a big thing. But they would have figured that out as they got there. And Doug's actually a smart person. So he knew that it wasn't just a little thing, even if he didn't want to admit it. So, but they would have figured that out. But it was really after we got to a change, I think, in the Republican Party, becoming much more ideological, much more focused on strange issues, from my perspective, that things got so toxic at the very end. And the book does address that, but in some ways the atmosphere did change. And I think it gets to the essence of what we're struggling with as a country right now, which is, what is the role of government? There are a lot of people in Washington who thinks there's no role for the government, and that's really hard to bring forth a bill like this if you think the government is evil and has no role. And then this question of what is fair taxes? What should people pay? Because we are a community. We live in a world where everybody's behavior affects everybody, and we live in a world where income distributions have been really gotten out of sorts because of our market economy. And it's interesting, when you study economics, you know that capitalism is the greatest thing except for one problem. It leads to maldistributions of income because a lot of the return that one gets is based on luck and intelligence, which is not randomly distributed. And so, in the old days, you say, well, that's what we have government for, is to fix some of the imbalances that occur with capitalism, but there doesn't seem to be any taste for that, so that gets complicated. So one question I would have for Richard is, how are these grassroots campaigns going to be affected by things like the Tea Party and the extreme views and sort of almost inability to undo some of that electorally? So it'd be interesting to see whether the next time we need to do this, whether it has to be different because of that, or maybe you disagree and think it was just as toxic pre-midterm elections than it was post-midterm elections. And then for Henry, just want to ask, it's interesting, if the Supreme Court throws out the mandate, I was never a big fan of the mandate. Neither was Obama, and I think it's partly because it's hard to ask poor people to have to buy something when there are a whole bunch of things they have to buy and they can't afford, and that gets to the essence of if you're poor, I think you have to make a lot of bad or tough choices, some of which are going to be bad choices, and it might be a bad choice not to spend some money on health insurance, but it's also a bad choice to buy the wrong food or to not put shoes on your kids' feet. So you're in a world where you're forced to make bad choices. And so the mandate, I think, I can understand why it's not popular with everyone. But the question is there are alternatives to the mandate. And so if the court overturned the mandate, you could go to Paul Starr's idea, which is just to say you don't have to buy insurance, but if you don't buy it, you have to wait 5 years to buy it again, and you're going to be experience rated. So the threat is that when you need it, it's going to be expensive, and that will lead you to. But could the administration change that ruling, or does that have to go all the way back to Congress and all the way through a decision-making process that would be toxic also? So those are some of my questions on that. Now let me move on to why some of this, what's going on in Washington, scares me, both for New York and in general, and that's that we have lots of other things we have to do in the healthcare system. I mean, coverage is one, but there are lots of other big issues. I mean, we have to figure out how to deal with Medicare and the fact that we're spending too much money on Medicare right now, and how do we close that gap? And of course, there are two ways: we could raise taxes a little bit, or we have to really fundamentally restructure how we pay for that program, what we cover in that program. Those would be very tough partisan issues that, if we're not in an atmosphere where there's any give and take, I don't know how we address them. And that gets at some of the fundamentals of what we have to grapple with. Is, as a healthcare system in our state and in other states, we have to figure out how to get expenditure growth to be closer to GDP, GDP +1, GDP +2, but there has to be some way of having a stable, or having the ability to keep expenditures somewhat stable relative to the size of our economy. And we don't know, we haven't figured out how to do that, and it would be tough decision-making to come up with a way of doing that. And of course, we know that part of that is getting rid of unnecessary costs of healthcare, but for me, an unnecessary cost is like too many radiological tests or too many expensive pharmaceuticals. For other people, that's called income. That's called the money I use to send my kids to college. And so how you grapple with tackling on that issue of lowering costs, but having it have an effect on some people who have a say in the political process is difficult. Even more important is we need to figure out how to deal with new technology. How do we make choices about what technologies to support all this genetic-based therapies, protein beams, scanners, exploding pharmaceuticals, bariatric surgery, and other things like that? These every year we're going to see more and more. And believe it or not, we're sort of in a pause right now. Some of these, we haven't had as many blockbuster expensive drugs in the last couple of years as we probably will over the next 5 to 10 years, and yet it's still a lot of pressure. We have to have a social way of making decisions about which of these things we want to invest in as a society, what do we want to pay for and not pay for, and there has to be some semblance of cooperation to make those decisions. It doesn't work if every time you don't want to do something, they say you're killing grandmom, or you're taking away essential freedoms by doing it. And yet, so that scares me. These are big decisions we have to make. What is core? What should every American have the right to? And what is boutique-y, and we're going to have to let the insurance system not cover it, whether it's some sort of fancy genetics or whatever. Those are difficult decisions I'd rather see made with some sense of people willing to talk to one another who are making these decisions. So now we come to New York. And say what I want to say in New York is the amazing thing is we see such dysfunction in Washington, and yet I would argue we see some good things going on in our state. First of all, I should note that this bill is really good for New York. If you look at it, any way you look at it, net, we come out way ahead. So if the Supreme Court undoes this, we have another budget problem. In the sense of it's sort of we would lose a fair amount in the way it was structured and how we get it. Pretty arcane to understand why we're winners, but we are winners on this. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But if you look at New York, we have Republicans, we have Democrats, and they don't love each other. Yet we are moving ahead and getting a lot done. If you look at the Medicaid redesign team, it's stunning stunning to me what that has done in the sense of somehow the hospital industry, the healthcare industry, is really working collaboratively to figure out how to live within a 3% cap on growth and Medicaid costs. And that's just being done. So the hospital industry is working away at it. The unions are working away at it. Different parts of the healthcare system not happy about it, but working to do it. And I'm often amazed at how much ownership of bringing about change and expenditures there is among providers. And I think there's some goodwill there, and surely a lot of energy that's being brought. We are tackling issues like adding care management through health homes and trying to redesign our primary care system in this state and doing some pretty innovative things out there and trying to make them work. And so that's crucial, I think, to getting our cost structure under control and improving the quality of health care. And we also are spending a fair amount on data, trying to get at electronic health records, trying to get an all-payer data system up and running. And of course, data sounds arcane, but it's crucial for providers to be able to figure out how to lower costs and how to better manage care. You can't manage care unless you know what happens to patients when they leave your office and go to specialists and go to hospitals. And we need to have a data system that allows you to track all that if we want providers to have responsibility to keep costs low. So I think all those things are happening in New York, which is good. And again, you look at some issues like the exchange, and that didn't get in the budget, but it will be taken care of by executive order. But even that, frankly, I think the Republican leadership would have gone for the exchange, but they were surely being influenced by the federal toxic atmosphere there. And I think in the end, we will design an exchange that has support of both sides and goes forward well. So I think I feel good that New York is a bit more functional than D.C. I wish maybe D.C. would learn from how we are doing things right now. And I guess I hope that this isn't a momentary pause and that breaks down. But anyway, thank you very much. I forgot to ask my second question. My second question is, this is related to the funding stuff too. Do super PACs change the possibilities for organizations like yours or efforts like yours? Will you be funded next time through a super PAC? Heck with foundations.
Anyway, Richard, there were a couple of questions in about just about super PACs, and then about you want to start with the grassroots efforts and how it's going to go forward. I mean, one question I guess I would have would be, you talk about in the book, it took a while for you to put together this coalition, and it certainly took support from the Atlantic Philanthropies, a lot of supporters, a lot of passion. Can the grassroots organizations pull it together if they have to start either from scratch, which is unlikely, or at least they have to, if they have to deal with a big hole in the legislation?
So these are all big challenges?
You have to say more than that.
Yes. I actually sometimes, going to the point that you made about the change in the politics we both made, think what would have happened if Mitt Romney had been elected president in 2008?
Interesting question.
Now, this is interesting because, and if he had said, oh, so let's do what I did in Massachusetts, I don't know what would have happened. One scenario is this was a Heritage Foundation idea that would have gone through. Another version, though, is that the Republican Party had become so ideologically more rigid that they still would have rejected him and he wouldn't have done it because he couldn't have gotten through the Senate. I don't know. But the fact we don't know just reflects the incredible polarization that we all see. And there is a chapter in the book called The Guns of August, which is a really untold story, which is how we actually beat the Tea Party in Democratic town hall meetings, which is a key reason that Democrats are willing to pass the legislation when they get back in the fall. Having said that, we certainly didn't beat them in 2010 elections, where the super PAC phenomenon funded by Karl Rove, scaring seniors, basically ended up with this Congress, which is so extraordinarily far to the right in the House, and really in the Senate too. So healthcare for America now continues to exist, but at a much lower level. The real question, so if you step back from this particular fight, I mean, there will be a huge fight around the law. And assuming that, and I agree with Hank, I think the best, if you had to predict 5-4 against the mandate, 6-3 to uphold in terms of severability, that's the best guess. Although who knows what's going to happen. There'll be that. So then the real question is, if Obama loses, then theoretically you'll have a Republican Congress and the whole thing will be repealed. Oh my God. But assuming that doesn't happen, you then are left with this huge debate in Congress on how to fix it.
Yeah.
And it's going to be nuts. And I don't really think anybody knows. But there will be huge mobilization on our side. There will be huge mobilization on the other side. It will be a royal battle. It will be, like Hank was saying, it will be an extraordinary battle. People will be engaged deeply, engaged fiercely. It will be that repeated again. In just one more thing. But, there's a larger story here. You have the Occupy Wall Street. You have the We Are the 99%. You have the sense in the country that the huge rise of inequality is really crushing and closing the middle class. Romney has to speak about that, even if the solutions are to make it worse. Rhetorically, he's got to do it because that's where the public is. Yeah. And so if you step back from this, the fundamental thing that's going on in this country is the fact that over the last 3 decades, we do see people's hopes being crushed with a huge rise of inequality. The fact that for the first time Americans don't feel like their kids are going to do better for objective reasons, that is going to define the politics of our country in very deep ways. And to Super PAC question, it's not going to be because Super PACs are going to fund that end of the equation. The fact is that the people who are driving the Super PACs are largely a group of about a dozen billionaires. And, there aren't billionaire progressives. They got there by being super capitalists. And even George Soros has sort of retreated from politics because his passion is more around the civil society. But economic injustice, he did make tons of money, like as a huge financier. So no. So one of the big challenges is can we have a democracy where one vote means more than $1 billion.
I guess I have a question for Hank. Assuming the mandate is struck down, what, if any, implications are there for a state that has a mandate, like Massachusetts, or for other states that might also want to use Medicare waiver in order to impose mandates? And that actually would be a mechanism that the president, or at least the past president, used to bring about change on its own. I don't know if you can discuss that.
Sure. I think the upshot of a decision by the court that strikes down the mandate, from a political science perspective, what that signifies is that the capacity of the federal government to regulate major national economic problems to some degree will be curtailed. I think at least in the immediate and near future. It's hard to see, given the political lay of the land, regardless of what comes of the coming election, that there will be a attempt by either the president or Congress to do something the equivalent of the mandate at the federal level, but through some other mechanism. For example, I think a lot of people have accepted the proposition that had Congress called the individual mandate a tax, and if they did this through the taxing power of Congress, who would question the capacity of the federal government to do it? After all, Medicare and Medicaid are unquestioned programs. Social Security our programs, at least for now, no one is questioning the constitutional validity of, and fundamentally those are, the revenues are derived from taxes. But I don't think the court, I hope not, but I don't think any of the parties arguing before the court are asking the court to cast a cloud on state initiatives or efforts. There's no reason to believe anything the court says or does will diminish the ability of individual states to create their own mandates. I don't think the Massachusetts model in any way will be jeopardized. If anything, the center of gravity will move from Washington to the states as the 50 laboratories experiment in various ways.
And Jim, thanks for talking about the bringing up the Medicaid redesign team, and it has been very interesting and made a great deal of progress. And I was wondering if there are lessons to be drawn there. Or is there something? Is there something about that institution that other states should consider in trying to bring about major reform within their systems? Is it, I mean, it's another laboratory possibility, but more of a homegrown type rather than one that was brought about through a Medicaid waiver as the Massachusetts bill was done?
I think the important thing with the redesign effort is the governor was able to make a convincing case that there was no revenue out there to let Medicaid keep growing, and just made that case with the hospital industry and the unions. And I think once they accepted that, at least temporarily, whatever, they were willing to be in an environment where they'd have a little bit more say over how they lived within the cap. Yeah. And so it became more cooperative there. And you think about it, as a hospital industry, you'd rather be able to pick and choose how to try to lower costs as opposed to have things randomly imposed on you. Right. And of course, there's some art to it also. It was agreed to at the moment when the recession was the deepest and the Medicaid rolls were the highest. If the economy picks up and Medicaid rolls shrink, there'll be more room within the cap because it really is an expenditure cap. So, so I think a lot of people were betting, a lot of the industry is betting on the economy improving, although that's been happening a lot less quickly than they might have hoped.
One of the few good things to come out of the recession, I suppose. So thank you very much. I would like to open it up to any questions from the audience. I'd be happy to keep on asking questions myself, but does anybody else want to ask? Go ahead.
If Obama were reelected...
Could you identify yourself, sir?
Dr. Arnold Ritterman, Schenectady. If Obama were reelected and had the opportunity, suppose the decision of the court were to throw out the Affordable Care Act, if Obama were reelected and had the opportunity to name another judge or two, I realize it would be pure speculation. Do you think the court would have any problem in reversing itself?
Well, the case will have been decided, the law will have been declared unconstitutional, so there would be no way for the court to revive the now declared unconstitutional statute. Would the court be willing to, let's just say for the sake of argument, the court strikes down the mandate on the theory that Congress can't regulate non-activity, which is fundamentally the argument that's being made by the challengers. Do I think a new justice on the court would be willing to revisit that ruling if for some reason or other Congress passed a statute again, one like it? Absolutely. I think one thing we've seen, some people bemoan this, but one thing we've seen by the court over the last couple of decades is a willingness to revisit precedents that people long had thought were established. We saw that, for example, in 2010 when the court in Citizens United struck down restrictions on unlimited independent expenditures by corporations. In the process of doing so, as the president indicated, over 100 years of precedent were turned aside, and the court took a new path. So a change in the composition of the court, I think, very definitely could lead to different kinds of decisions coming from the court. I do think there'd be some regard and respect for precedent, I think a new justice of a different disposition than the current conservative majority would not willy-nilly abandon previously decided cases, but I think we'd have every reason to expect if you had a 5-justice majority of a different ideological outlook than the current conservative block of justices that we can expect different kinds of decisions.
Yes, sir. Michelle.
I don't know which of the justices leaves, of course.
It's coming along.
I'm Sean. I'm with the Legislative Gazette. I'm interested, I guess, from your perspective, how likely it is that Cuomo is going to set up an exchange via executive order like he's promised. You were talking about a possible Democrat-Republican coalition, but that doesn't seem likely going forward.
All indications are that there will be an executive order in the next couple of weeks that will keep it developing. And of course, the Department of Health has been working full steam to design the exchange anyway, with a lot of federal support. The interesting question is, I still think that after the November election, if Obama was reelected and the courts ruled that the law was fine, you would see the Republicans and Democrats in New York get together and sort of fix whatever needed to be fixed on the exchange. I think there's still goodwill on that issue in the long run.
Even if the federal law gets struck down?
No, I would say if the federal law was upheld, I think you'd see people say, okay, we have to implement this law, let's do it in the best possible way. But nobody's going to take on that issue until they see what happens in June and then in November. So.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Oh, just a moment.
Did you hear that?
No.
And Edith Allen, a retired economist, and my question is, the New York programs already have Medicaid to a higher income level, and they have Healthy New York for small business owners. How close are we to an exchange already? And how would it fit in with existing programs?
Do you want me to try that? We are very different from the rest of the country. A lot of different groups of people have coverage almost up to 200% or 150% of poverty. So the people, but not everybody. So a single man is not covered, but a female head of household would be. So it depends on what category you're in. But the important thing is that the new law for New York helps people between, say, 150 and 400% of poverty, as opposed to the people at the low end, because we've already taken care of people at the lower end in our state. If you go to Mississippi or Texas, the Medicaid program only covers people up to 33% or 50% of poverty. Those are states that are going to see great expansions of Medicaid. We're not going to see much expansion of Medicaid at all in this state. What we're going to see is more people in the 200 to 400% poverty range receiving subsidies to buy insurance on the exchange.
One of the other things, of course, is if the exchange is established, how does it function? So in Massachusetts, the exchange has been what people call an active purchaser. And as a result, it basically only allows insurance companies into the individual market that meet certain standards in terms of quality and of access, and also in terms of the amount they charge. And so you've had a limited number of plans with low inflation in terms of premiums and good statistics in terms of access to coverage. So the exchange can actually be a way of actually driving a much, from a consumer point of view and from a better market in terms of healthcare, and also contribute to this whole question that Medicaid restructuring is doing, which is how do you provide more incentives for a healthcare delivery system that focuses on value, on quality at good cost. Exchange could also not do that, be more of an open market and not form some pretty important functions.
Yes, ma'am.
Barbara Bartoletti, League of Women Voters, New York State Legislative Director for Richard. Considering that at the moment we have no influence over the Supreme Court, they will do what they will do. But your group, your coalition, how do you feel about the way that the message never really got out there that would make people aware of the good things that we've talked about under the affordable health care. And going forward in the presidential campaign, do you see the groups that you put together, and perhaps even the Obama campaign, really putting together the message that may, even at this late date, serve to really put a better spin to the message that apparently never got out there during these 2 years, or perhaps the far right would not have had as much success if they have had in allowing this Affordable Care Act to be the worst evil of our century?
Well, there's a lot of, the question you asked, Barbara, is one that a lot of people have asked, and it shows that the difficulties of communicating, and also how much the president hasn't engaged, because his administration actually has engaged. HHS has done a huge amount of stuff to promote the benefits of the law. They've just constantly, since March of 2010, aggressively pushed all the things that the law does, with lots and lots of press and reports and everything else. And there's been a whole bunch of organizations in Washington that have tried to do that, from major groups, the AARP and all sorts of others. So the question is, so why hasn't it gone through? So a couple things here. So first of all, again, remember the polling numbers I talked about before. It's not as bad as it seems. And Washington tends to drive things in the press in a pretty monochromatic way. And so again, there's much more support for the law than it seems. The division is very, very partisan. And so if you look at the opposition, a tremendous amount is from Republicans, where there's been a huge drive from Fox News and the Republican Party and the candidates to demonize the law, and that's where there's intense opposition. They're not going to listen to positive messages. Democrats are favorable for it, although somewhat confused. Independents are somewhat opposed, but very confused. Now, I say the president, but the president hasn't so who's got a big enough megaphone to constantly have a different message? It's been the president, and he hasn't chosen to do that because of the pressing concerns around the economy, number one. One, because he got caught before the summer in the deficit debate, and his last attempt to be bipartisan, and got kicked in the face one more time. He finally learned he can't do that with this Republican Party. Since then, he's been much more of a populist on the economy, and that's what he's going to need to get reelected. The other thing is, think about in the debates between the president and Governor Romney what he can say, which is, Mitt, you should be proud of this. 99.5% of kids in Massachusetts are covered. 95% of people are covered. More businesses provide coverage. Costs are going down. Fewer people use the emergency room. It's very popular. It's a huge accomplishment. Romney Care, you should love Romney Care. And the only reason you don't is because you're such a captive of the right, and because you're willing to do whatever it takes to get reelected. And the American public needs to have someone who's got a core commitment to values. But it's going to make it, Santorum's right. It's going to be much harder, at least at the presidential level, to make Obamacare an issue with Romney as the nominee.
It is an interesting situation. Usually when we start with major legislation, social legislation, the programs start off relatively simple. So we have old age assistance, or we have aid-dependent children, or we have Medicaid, or Medicare, which were relatively small programs compared to what they are now. Here we start off with a big program that's very complicated and stretches over many areas. So the educational and public explanation issue is much more demanding, and so it is a tough issue. But anyway, we'll go on. Let's see, we have a question over here, and then we'll come over here.
Hello, I wish I met all three of you before. I covered all your areas. I used to be in D.C. and covered healthcare on Capitol Hill. My name is Susan Van Skyke St. Laurent. I also did foreign policy. But I'm interested in this because I've had to talk to Republicans and Democrats and in between. The biggest thing you have right now is a flaw, and it's the right of conscience. And they felt like they've been snowballed all over the place on this. And that's basically what the big factor is at this point in the elections on both sides. Alrighty, and I think you should address it, and I think there is a framework that can be done where both sides come to the table and can actually resolve this. And no one has talked to about medical training, opening up more medical schools, not having nepotism rule the day, and the money. No one's talked about easy access to actual education. And I've seen people from all over the world with great talent not allowed to be medical doctors in the United States, including your own medical students who are biology majors and chemistry majors with 4.0, but did not have the parents who had the money to put in the people's pockets to go to med school. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Well, one thing I'd say that, we should change medical education the way it's funded so that we get a lot more primary care doctors. And years ago, we visited Canada, the group organized in New York. And, there, at least back then, basically the government paid for the cost of your medical education if you went into things that were needed. If you wanted to go into things that weren't needed, then you had to pay for it on your own. So there's a lot more we could do to make the fact that right now 2% of graduating doctors are going to primary care because they don't get paid as much. They have these huge debts. So there is a lot we could do to make much more access to get and more other kind of providers into healthcare.
Yeah, no, very good point. Yes, sir.
This is Ram Chug from Amazoni retiree. My question for number 2 speaker. This is more a question, fundamental question about the American government system, checks and balances. And I have grown up, I'm not a legal scholar, but I've grown up on the system that the Supreme Court is the highest body in whom you have a lot of esteem, a lot of respect, because it's made up people who are very objective, assess situation in a very dispassionate way, and look at the issue from the constitutional point of view. They listen to all the arguments, but do not inject themselves in the discussion. They are neutral observer from a distance. And I have lived, whatever they decide, I have always accepted the decision based on the interests of the society and so on. And I never heard the arguments. I didn't even know how they decide. They're done in every tower, as you mentioned. But this is the first time I heard the arguments oral on Tuesday. And I was shocked, disappointed, disillusioned with the kind of questions judges asked. No one with some kind of training in a little bit of economics would compare buying broccoli with healthcare. It is something on that day, my respect, esteem for the judges was lost. I'm disillusioned because I just can't tell my friends what a Supreme Court can do. We hold the Supreme Court in the highest level. And I just can't even share it with you, my disappointment. And it's really not a good reflection of the legal profession. First, not even knowing the difference as a judge, with all the years of experience and training, it doesn't reflect well on their education, in my judgment. Second thing is there is a recent article in New York Times yesterday where they're talking of limiting the term of judges to a term appointment. It just came out by some professor from, I think, Stanford or Duke. So I'm just trying to share with you it doesn't matter how they decide. It really doesn't matter to me right now because mine is a bigger issue. Holding Supreme Court as the highest body makes objective, dispassionate judgments for the future of the country.
Well, I think the Chief Justice, John Roberts, the issues you've raised, I think he's very acutely aware of and sensitive to. It's a fascinating thing about American democracy, but the edicts of the Supreme Court are honored and respected in large measure because of the reservoir of support and respect that the court has amongst members of the citizenry. There's the famous line of Andrew Jackson, who didn't think very highly of John Marshall, where he once said, well, now he's ruled, let's see him enforce it. Of course, over the course of our history, the country has respected the decisions of the Supreme Court. I mean, one of the Bush versus Gore, one of the most controversial decisions of a court in American history. One of the fascinating things is how Al Gore, within hours of the court's decision, went before the American people and said, "This is our system of government. I will accept the ruling of the court." So I think the Chief Justice is very, very aware that the final product be one that is respected, not necessarily agreed with by everyone, that's not possible, but be respected as the product of objective analysis and dispassionate thinking. That's why the justices have lifetime tenure. The concept is that they're given a degree of independence, that they shouldn't concern themselves with political wins. So I think the Chief Justice is very aware of it. I suspect the justices are very aware of it. I know at one point during the oral argument, I think even the Chief Justice wasn't pleased with, I think his phrase was, the frivolity of some of the questions. So, you know, I'm hopeful and cautiously optimistic that the court will produce a result that goes without saying we won't all necessarily agree with, but we can all respect.
Yes, sir.
Mike President from Albany.
Yes.
If the court throws it out, given particularly in New York State where we are covering Medicaid not up to the people from the bottom, and the narrow window of people who are uncovered compared to other states, what might the court say, and how would we move to be that new laboratory saying, here's what we can do? And because I sensed that between the discussion of the last comments that the Supreme Court does not want to get out on a limb where they really look foolish and ridiculed, and people won't respect them as they do. So that whatever they do, if they strike it down, they will give us a route. Is it feasible and easily feasible for New York to move in that direction? How would that happen?
Well, why don't I ask the first part of the question and then throw it to the others? County Executive President, I don't think the court will do anything to limit the capacity of states to experiment. I don't think that's sort of being asked by any of the litigants before them to do, and I can't imagine they would do anything to call into question so many of the reforms that are in the Affordable Care Act are already law in New York State. So I don't think it's going to limit in any way New York's flexibility or capacity to innovate in this area.
I wasn't questioning that, I agree.
Theoretically, the state could apply for a mega waiver, as they would call it, and actually it's already applying for one. And what that does is give them a chunk of money from Medicaid program usually, and they can use that as they wish, or they have to show their design. What they have to prove to the federal government is that they will not cost the federal government any more by undertaking a different way of doing a financing package. And New York has done that in the past successfully. It would be a mega waiver to do that. And I'm not sure I could see how it would work unless there could also be some Medicare involvement. You know, because a lot of the costs out there are the dually eligible, so they'd have to work out that problem. But I haven't heard people talking about it, but it's an intriguing idea.
Funding the exchange.
Yeah, no. So what New York State would have to say is, we'd like to subsidize people between 150 and 400% of poverty. And we think that given the reductions in bad debt and charity care, the efficiencies in the health system, that would pay for itself. You know, and maybe they'd have to actually collect the premiums and stuff to do it. It's not beyond the pale, but not something we'd be rushing to do quickly, I guess. You know, but.
And the other thing, which if you just step back, so if the mandate is overturned and with it, say, guaranteed issue and community rating, we have guaranteed issue and community rating in New York. We're going to have, the subsidies would still be in place. So then, if New York were to institute its own mandate, it's in a position to solve the biggest problem in the individual market we already have, which is so expensive because of the fact that you don't have a mandate. So, you know, you have the political problem with the Republicans controlling the Senate, but, you know, from a rational point of view, for them and for the whole state, instituting a mandate with the structure in New York with the new federal subsidies, income-based subsidies, would be really easy to do, would solve the biggest problem with the individual market, and really between that and the Medicaid expansion, would very easily rationalize the healthcare system and look like Massachusetts in a short amount of time. We're really close in New York to looking like Massachusetts. Just doing the mandate with the government, and now the fact of the subsidies, it's that easy, almost. And so the question is, can we get people to focus on that?
Well, you know, it seems like ancient history now, but when Elliot Spitzer first came in, he started to think about doing what Massachusetts had done, having a mandate, and then of course he ran into his own issues, and the economy fell apart, and and then federal reform came in. So it was on the agenda at one point in New York, and I guess it could be. I think the money would be, see, we have more uninsured than Massachusetts, and so part of the reason we do well with this bill is because there's new money, so we'd have to somehow figure out.
It's all those subsidies. The individual subsidies are enormous for people. Income-based subsidies are totally, and they go a long way.
And the question is whether the feds would give us all that to help us.
Well, but that won't, I mean, throwing out the mandate and the things will not throw out the subsidies. The problem is the subsidies, they'll still be based on your income. They just won't go as far because premiums will be so much more. So you bring the premiums down with the mandate and you're done. We're that close. It's not complicated. And the political logic of it would be great. And what the Republicans would hopefully, and Democrats would be hesitant to understand is, it's really popular in Massachusetts. It would become really popular because then all these people can afford affordable coverage, which they can't now. The thing about the polling and the mandate, if you explain to people how it works, which is to say, it's crazy to require people to buy health coverage now because it's unaffordable. But it's not unaffordable for most people with the subsidies. When you explain that to people, they say, oh yeah, even the polling now, if a poll that explains how it works, the income-based subsidy, and it's tied to no existing conditions, then the mandate becomes popular. So it's not that much of a leap.
I forgot that the subsidies would stay.
Subsidies stay.
Assuming they don't throw out the entire law.
We hope. And I think Richard's point, he made it during his talk, is and of course this is pure speculation, but if we assume the court strikes down the mandate, apropos of what we were talking about with Justice Roberts and the reputation of the court, strictly speaking, this isn't a legal consideration. But if I had to guess, I would think he and perhaps Justice Kennedy would want to find a way to preserve some portion of the bill and to vote with the democratically appointed judges to uphold some substantial portion of the bill. So that's why I think at least there's something of a conventional wisdom beginning to gel around the idea that most of the law will remain intact, although the mandate may fall. And the other important pieces, nevertheless, but the ones the administration are saying should fall with the mandate, would probably go by the boards as well.
And those are, and I just learned this from an attorney who's spending a lot of time looking at, in the congressional findings, which are looked to for severability, there are only two things that Congress specifically relates to the mandate: guaranteed issue and community rating. So given the way court normally approaches that, it would be easy for them to say, okay, those are the two things Congress found are related. Those go, everything else stays. New York's got those two things.
Well, thank you very much. We've run out of time. Before I dismiss everybody, and also thank our wonderful panel, I just want to say one thing. Many of our forums over the last few years have been organized by Bob Ward, who's here with us. Unfortunately, this is the last week Bob is going to be with us here at the Institute. He's going to go off to be a deputy comptroller of New York State. We're proud of that. We will miss him. But in the meantime, we'll just go on and try to have great forums despite his absence. So what I'd like to do, though, is applaud both our panelists, Bob, and everybody else involved in this wonderful forum today. Thank you.